Then the Israelite foreman went and appealed to Pharaoh, "Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people." Pharaoh said, "Lazy, that's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks." The passage goes on and develops a little bit further. There are a number of ways for us to approach Scripture, and I'm sure you know many of these ways yourselves. Sometimes people take these words as testament to an historical event which occurred once upon a time. I will be continually referring to the narratives of the Scriptures, what the narrative says. There's a difference between what the narrative says and what actually happened. The archaeological data that's been compiled over the past decade indicates not only when the pyramids were constructed, but how they were constructed and by whom. Most scholars who are doing this work now agree that they are anything but slaves. For one thing, the quality of the workmanship is not indicative of work that's done by slaves. These were craftsmen, they were artisans, they were people with highly cultivated skills, highly valued skills. We also know, in addition to archaeological data, archaeological artifacts, there are written artifacts, notes from one worker to another, letters that were left behind, that indicate that, in fact, these people worked for a wage and that they expected their wage, and that when the wage was not forthcoming for whatever reason, they engaged in what we would consider job actions, work slowdowns, and even strikes. So this sort of data is not harmonious with the old story that the pyramids and other great monuments in ancient Egypt were built by slaves. That does not, however, mean that the people who compiled the narratives that come to us in the Old Testament themselves didn't see themselves as the descendants of people who were in bondage, people who were enslaved. Clearly, they saw themselves as having been liberated from something, and that's a very important part of their narrative. By the time ancient Egypt reached one of its high points, 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, the ancient Near East had been a place where various cultures had engaged in a mutual give and take, trading and marketing material commodities, foodstuffs, also trading and marketing stories and theological ideas. So that by the time the people of Israel come into being, whenever that was, they were forming themselves within a culture in which the exchange of ideas and stories and theological concepts had been a tradition for literally thousands of years. The technical term is syncretism. It's cultural blending. So it's not an accident that Israelite religion and the texts that Israelites produced share so many features in common with other cultures from the ancient Near East. The idea of cultural blending did not stop with the ancient Israelites. It continued down to the time of Jesus and beyond. So Christianity itself displays cultural features of the dominant culture around it. Take, for instance, the revered imagery of Mary holding the infant Jesus. If you go to Egypt, at any temple, at any part of a museum, you'll see pictures of the goddess Isis holding her son Horus. These become the model for the way in which Mary and Jesus were portrayed as mother and child, mother God and child God. The idea that God is one is not an idea that is usually associated with Egyptian culture and Egyptian theology. But in fact, prior to the formation of the people of Israel, for a period of about 60 years, one particular Egyptian pharaoh forbade the worship of all other gods and preserved the worship of only one God. God was one. So the people of Israel and their texts, which became part of our scriptures, adopted features of the Egyptian culture that was all around them. Sinai, of course, figures prominently in the Exodus narratives. It's also a place of austerity where we find, for example, St. Catherine's Monastery. St. Catherine's is not just important from the point of view of the Israelite traditions. It's also a place that figures prominently in Christian spirituality. It's the location of one of the oldest monasteries that we know of, a monastery that's been continuously active since the 4th century, one of the few that can make that claim. It's also a place where in the 19th century, the oldest, most complete version of the New Testament manuscript was found, what's called Sinaiticus. In the retelling of the Exodus story, we think of the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, as a land flowing with milk and honey. Sometimes we forget that it was also a land filled with peoples, that the ancient world was not just a world for the Israelites, but the Israelites were one ethnic group among many. And that more often than not, these ethnic groups coexisted with one another, not only peacefully and harmoniously, but lived with one another symbiotically. They gained from one another. They traded with one another. They came to one another's mutual support from time to time. They shared stories, narratives about their self-consciousness, their identity as peoples. So all of the foundational mythology of ancient Near Eastern peoples includes stories of long journeys, Exodus stories, includes pilgrimage, includes motifs of people feeling closer to God in the midst of desert areas, the role of the desert in forming individual and collective spirituality, the idea of gods being resident in particular places. All of these ideas were held in common by the peoples of the ancient Near East.
When we were on Mount Sinai, thinking of the desert mothers and fathers that came out and away from a place, the things that swirl around you get stripped away. It would be easier, perhaps, to hear God's voice, but also easier to identify all the voices that claim our attention, that clamor around us in our lives.
All the strength or powers under your control are all gone. And you are right there before the presence of the Almighty.
They left so much material, so many sayings that were inspired by Scripture. You heard the reminiscence of different Scripture passages in their sayings. It's pretty clear they came up to identify with what they thought was an authentic Christian life. It was a deliberate giving up of material comfort. It was voluntary poverty. It was a way of escaping distractions of city life, urban life. It's almost to the last one. They came from Rome, they came from Ephesus, they came from Constantinople, and they sought out the most remote region on earth to live out their spirituality. And it had to do with remembering, I think, their reliance on God only. Mm-hmm. It had to do with giving up the illusion that life is something that we produce, that the blessings come from God.